afternoon. Good afternoon to members of the committee and to the witnesses who are before us. The list has changed a lot. There have been replacements. Mr. Simard will be replacing Ms. Posey. Mr. Boulidis, who is online, is replacing Ms. Collins. Ms. Shanahan, who is also online, is replacing Mr. Longfields. Ms. Koutrakis, online, is replacing Mr. Ali. Mr. Lozon, who's here in person, is replacing Ms. Taylor-Roy. Mr. Martel, who's here in person, is replacing Mr. Cram. Mr. Gourde is replacing Mr. Major. So that's the committee today. Before we begin, I'd like to simply remind everyone around the table to be careful to prevent acoustic incidents, to not injure our magnificent interpreters. So what that means is if you don't have the floor, please turn your microphone off. If you need to put your earpiece down for any reason, please put it on the little sticker that's on the table. And I think that's about it. Do not hit your microphone. Do not hit what you have in front of you here. And everything should go well. So, without further ado, for the first hour, we have with us Steve Saint-Gelais, President of Boisaco. He's accompanied by the General Manager, André Gilbert. And from the municipality of Sacré-Cœur, we have the pleasure of welcoming the Mayor, Lise Boulian. So I presume we will begin. I always go with what's on the list here. I presume we will begin with Mr. Saint-Gelais. You have 5 minutes. Do I need to? I think it would be better to have Ms. Boulian begin. I am open to that. Ms. Boulian, go ahead. So, hello, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. I will speak today about Sacré-Cœur, of course. Sacré-Cœur is born of the forest and has depended on the forest since it was founded. The people of Sacré-Cœur have the forest in their DNA. Sacré-Cœur is part of Haute-Côte-Nord, a regional municipality that is one of the most struggling in Quebec. For 40 years, Boisaco has been the economic engine of our village and the whole region. The loss of jobs related to the closure of the factory would hit about 70% of our population without taking into account the impact on the whole region. It's nearly impossible to anticipate all of the devastating impacts, unthinkable to foresee all of the consequences of such a disaster following the decision by the federal government. How can we imagine everybody getting up one morning without any idea of what their future could look like? This would be devastating for our municipality. What would happen to our families? What would happen to our children? What would be the consequences psychologically? For decades, Sacré-Cœur has shown initiative, cooperation, dynamism, and solidarity to ensure its development. And that is what we do still today, to show our commitment to a community that believes in its development, that will always rely on the forest industry. Our young people, and those who are a little less young, have invested in a future that was proposed to them by going to school to pursue this future, a future they believed in. They've gone to professional training for forest harvesting. They've gone to Cégep to become, for example, forest technicians. And they've gone to university to become forest engineers. And this is just a few examples. All of this training that would be swept away. Over 600 workers who believed and still believe in sustainable development of our forests, who believe especially in living alongside animals and the forest industry through concrete actions. For our municipality, Boisseco is an important player. The Boisseco Group contributes to the economic development, the cultural development, and the tourism and social sector through significant investments for our municipality and various nonprofit organizations and in neighboring municipalities. How can a government believe in the survival of 225 caribou based on the emergency order without looking out for the survival of a village, our whole community? Has Mr. Guilbeault really seriously reflected on the solution proposed? Has he really reflected on the consequences of this order on our people? I have with me today a folder that you can look at to learn more about our town. It's not the most recent, but it shows how our area is dynamic and cares about its development, and especially that Sacré-Cœur is what it is today, largely thanks to the forest industry that has been in our area since 1870. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Now we will go to Mr. Saint-Gelais. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, we appreciate the opportunity to finally officially express ourselves on this order, and we thank you for this opportunity. For our workers, for our people, and for our communities of the Haute-Côte-Nord, a countdown has begun with this emergency order on June 18th. Since this announcement, our lives have been suspended. Instead of joy, we have anxiety. In the past, our environment, our sector has known poverty. After 3 failures of initiatives to operate wood processing in Sacré-Cœur, many people at the time went through human tragedies. Some had to turn to employment insurance, welfare, and other sources of similar assistance that imperil human dignity. Our sector, our area, has had bankruptcies, psychological distress, divorces, and an increased use of alcohol and drugs. Fortunately, the courage and determination remained strong. I'll explain. Following the 3rd failure and the bankruptcy of 1982, the Imperial Bank of Commerce took possession of assets under guarantee. The only offer it had received was to take things down. The people of our area refused that destiny and refused to give up. They showed solidarity and mobilization. They blocked roads for many days, even weeks. This is how they were heard, and they were able to propose that they would buy it in a collective, unusual way with 2 workers' co-ops, COFOD and Uniseco, as well as a company called Investra, owned by local citizens. About 600 workers and people bet everything in 1985 to set up this collective ownership. Today, 40 years later, over 1,100 people and investors are part of Boisseco. It's important to understand that the mission of Boisseco Group is about sustainable development in a responsible way to ensure the social, economic, environmental, and cultural vitality of our area. Respecting this mission, 7 companies have joined the Boisseco ecosystem over time. Sacopan, Repco, Verseco, Granulco, Valleybois, Forestco, and Bois du Fjord. All of that is collective ownership. The Haute-Côte Nord is where we live. It has about 10,000 people, and it's part of the regional municipalities that struggle the most in Quebec. It goes without saying that all of our sources of income are important. We need to protect them, and we need to develop more. It's important to be aware that forestry as practiced in Quebec has internationally recognized certifications, and the Forestry Plan of Quebec is among the most strict in the world. And people from around the world have told us that when they've audited our operations. We care about contributing to sustainable, responsible development of our forests and producing some of the greenest products that all Canadians need to build our houses, among other things. The forest is our past, our present, and our future. It is our way of life, and it has been part of our culture for many generations. We are proud of that. For us, work is a right that allows humans to live in dignity, to support their families, and to flourish. If this order is adopted, 600 direct jobs will disappear, and it will be the loss of $200 million in annual benefits for our sector. That is unthinkable. The impact on human beings have to be taken into account. This emergency order must be abandoned. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Gelais. So now we will go to questions with members of the committee. We'll begin with Mr. Martel. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today with us. I'm pleased to have you. So first, to Mr. Saint-Gelais or Mr. Gilbert, we've heard from people, and people from my riding think that the caribou is threatened. So I'd like to know, when we talk about threatened species, do you agree with that? Or do you think differently? Well, Mr. Martel, let's talk about the facts. The facts, there is just one type of caribou in Quebec, the woodland caribou, a subspecies. So there's just one subspecies of caribou in Quebec, the woodland caribou, and there are 3 ecotypes. The migratory one further in the north, there's the boreal caribou in the forest, and the mountain caribou in mountainous regions. So the ecotypes are defined like that by biologists, and so it's based on the environment or the place where the caribou live. So in the north, the migratory, the forest type, and then the mountain type. So that's the reality of the subspecies, the only subspecies that exists in Quebec. So it's important to understand that. If we look at the boreal ecotype, the caribou that lives in the forest, the different data we've had since 2013, so the plan for their recovery and the Gélina Commission, the report from 2023, the data give us a relative stability between 2013 and 2023 for the boreal ecotype. And then the boreal ecotype, the latest inventory have highlighted that 80% of the individuals surveyed are either in protected areas or north of the northern limit where there is no forestry happening. So when you look at the overall picture of the boreal ecotype, you have to recognize that there's just one subspecies present in Quebec, and the boreal ecotype, we have to be specific about that and look at the count for those individuals. For all of these subspecies, we can see that the subspecies is not threatened in Quebec. Mr. Saint-Gelais, you've had consultations on that. Have you had the opportunity to speak? Federal consultations? Yes, federal consultations. Look, for federal consultations, what we've been told during the first technical meeting, we were told that the order was prepared and that there won't really be any changes, significant changes that can be presented for the concerned areas. So to us, it has shown that there wasn't really any possible angle for discussions, because what we were told, and we're also told at the first technical meeting, that the order was made in the spirit of balancing protection and the impact on the sector. So you'll understand that we saw, unfortunately, that it wasn't the case because the answers were not obtainable, and to not be able to make any changes significantly, so there wasn't anything we could change.
Mr. Gilbert, when we talk about the idea of an emergency in this order, what do you have to say about that? Well, as was said, the forest ecotype is a subtype. There are 180,000 of them in Quebec, and the numbers are going up. So what we don't really understand, because the woodland caribou has been here for many years, and in Pipmoincan, there's already been an 80% disturbance rate of the environment since the 80s. And in the Pipmoincan sector, in the past, we found that there were 135 caribou. And then in 2012, there were 98 rather. And then later on, we found that there were 225. So what conclusions can we take from this? There is no emergency. So we're also going to look at the number of females in the population, and we have biologists, specialists that look at this, and what they say is that we need to be very careful with the numbers that we have here, because the females, when they hear the helicopters, when they're going to identify how many caribou there are often going to run away. So the difficulty is that we may not have the correct numbers, and so experts are telling us to be careful when we're looking at this data. Thank you. We'll listen to Ms. Chatel now. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to members of the committee and to our witnesses for being here with us today. Very happy to have an elected official here with us today. Welcome. So it's 2024. And we know that all governments need to work together. We're building an economy here, and an economy is founded upon our Earth's resources. I come from a rural area, and there are excellent forestry companies. And where I'm from, we work together with provincial MPs, with local elected officials, in Vallée de la Gatineau, in Pontiac, and their prefectures. And it's together that we're going to succeed. We need to work hand in hand. And so we have no more time. And I'm sorry to get into politics. Your provincial governments, municipal governments, federal governments, we all need to work together to find solutions. And I believe that when we work together, we find solutions. We need to protect caribou. There's no discussion on that because this is a species that's going extinct. And humans are a species as well. We all live together. We need to protect our environment and our economy. These go hand in hand. But I also think that human beings have a basic right to dignity, to be able to have a strong economy in rural areas, and forestry companies have a huge responsibility to ensure this prosperity, not just today, but tomorrow. And so you are responsible for ensuring that our regional economies in Sacré-Cœur will succeed today, but also in the future for our children. So what I'd like to hear is, what do you expect from governments so that should they be working with you to find a solution? Thank you, Ms. Chatel, for your question. So I'll come back to what we shared earlier. With the information that we have shared and just looking at the facts, and you can find them on the Government of Quebec's ministry website, they're written out. There is only one subspecies of caribou in Quebec. That's the woodland caribou. There are 3 ecotypes, but it's the same caribou everywhere. So 3 ecotypes. But what you need to understand, and this is very important, I think we need to remove this perception that the species itself is threatened. Now, certain ecotypes may need a little bit more attention from us. That's fair, but the species itself is not threatened in Quebec. I think it's important to understand that. When we look at what we want to find as a solution, we need to be able to have this in the background at all times. So, Ms. Chatel, you said humans need to be a part of the ecosystem, and I agree. We need to take into account many other elements as well. We need a large, broad outlook, and we needn't focus only on one detail. I don't have very much more time. I have another question. Since 2016, Quebec has said that there is a decline in the species and that they were going to create a strategy. Do we have a strategy? So we have been working for 4 years intensively on this file. The provincial government was facing a situation that could have been catastrophic, but we worked hard. We became aware of the situation and made changes. Over the last 6 months, there has been a big change in mentality. We've realized that there is an issue. And I also want to mention something that was done in our region. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt because I have questions for the mayor as well. But we do need a strategy, and we need one quickly. But you could also send us further answers, written answers after the committee, if need be. Mayor, welcome. Did you participate in the federal consultations, with the federal government? So I've been working with Boissaco. I did not participate in any consultations, but I have been working so that my municipality be able to survive. We have 1,700 people living in our region who depend entirely on agriculture as well as on tourism, and 70% of the population depends upon the forest, as I said earlier. Like I said, we need to work together. I would invite you to raise your voice in these consultations, not just through the industry, but really speak on behalf of your community directly during these consultations. I know that that's how we do it where I'm from, and I invite you to do that, and that's what I am planning on doing, Ms. Chatel. Were you consulted with by the government of Quebec on this issue? Yes, we did participate in consultations. It was, I think, 2 years ago. Do you have requests for federal and provincial elected officials? Well, to work with our forestry companies. There are people here in my region that are able to offer solutions to our governments. And I think it's very important that we work together. Thank you. Mr. Simard, your turn. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, right off the bat, I'd like to say, Mr. Saint-Gelais, Madame Boulienne, you are very courageous because for some time we've been talking about the anxiety that this has created in your areas, and I'm very well aware of this. 70%, Mayor, you said, of Sacré-Cœur residents depend upon forestry. And that includes Boissaco, of course. Now, of course, we do not hope that the order be put into place, but what is the feeling in your area? Are people afraid? So this morning, I wouldn't speak of courage. I'd more so speak of determination. Yes, this has had impacts. I've spoken with people in Boissaco. What we found is that in our municipality, there are practically no more requests for new builds, for construction. They're not asking for building permits anymore. So people are definitely nervous, and they're trying to protect the assets that they have. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there are people in Sacré-Cœur that believe that if this order is implemented, they see this as the closure of their municipality. I think that yes, it is obvious that if Boissaco closes, it will be very dramatic. Thank you. Now, I have been interested in the question of forestry for a long time, and what often comes up is people who say that there are some questionable practices in the forestry industry. But what's great with Boissaco is that this is a company that decided to really invest in creating new value in the industry. Many people in the industry have told me actually that you have exceptional practices. So this order would apply to one of the good guys in the forestry sector. And I'd like to congratulate you for being one of the good guys, Mr. Saint-Gelais. Now, let's talk about the goal of protecting this species and the ecotype. We can't protect this ecotype without proper forest management. We know that we have issues related to pests and to forest fires. So if we are not managing these forests properly, things are not going to work out. Do you think that we have the possibility to protect this ecotype? I'll ask my colleague to respond. Yes, Mr. Gilbert. So this is a wonderful question. We have forestry engineers in Quebec that look at this. So imagine someone's building a new home. They need to look at a variety of different elements. They're going to talk to plumbers, electricians, experts in their field. And it's the same thing for forestry engineers. They're going to talk to experts on woodland caribou. This is essential. So these engineers are trained to take into account all of these elements that make up the forest. So the plants, the wildlife, broader biodiversity. And this also includes forest fires as well as pests in the forest. Currently, in Canada, in Quebec, we are experiencing intense forest fire seasons. And forest management is an important response to these issues that allows us to reduce the intensity of these forest fires. A forest that is properly managed will mean that there will be fewer impacts from these forest fires. And I've seen this on a personal level. I've seen how these fires spread. And it's important also to take into account as you mentioned, Mr. Simard, is that like when we're taking into account this forest management, we also have to think about the fact that some of this forest management is not going to prevent pest infestations. Over the past 12 years, about 80% of our lumber that we're harvesting has been affected by a pest. More specifically, the eastern spruce budworm. So after a fire, it can take 25 to 30 years before the forest completely recovers. And so we have to think about our response to climate change, because this also allows us to create a healthy habitat for caribou in the case where we face natural disasters. Because we're talking about natural disasters that have always existed and will continue to exist. Caribou is largely influenced by a variety of elements. They live in the forest in a small number, and they're very spread out. So yes, of course, they're influenced by disturbance of the forest, but also climate. There are recent studies in the West that stated very clearly that climate change actually has a greater impact than disturbance in the forest. Thank you. It's now Mr. Boulris's turn. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you to our witnesses of our first panel. So this is a very important study on the future of woodland caribou, which is an ecotype of a subspecies in Quebec. Thank you very much. This is very important for many reasons in our regions in terms of jobs and the forestry industry, the future of young people. And with the NDP, we are very concerned. We want to be able to see true sustainable development so that there will be a future for young people in these affected regions in Côte-Nord, Charlevoix, Gaspésie, amongst others. So we are concerned about this, and we also have a responsibility towards species that are endangered. And so we can't just share beautiful speeches during COP15 in Montreal. The whole world, the UN was present, and there were a lot of great speeches, but we need to focus on science, on facts, and I'm happy to hear what has been shared here today. And it is a very complex issue. There are a lot of elements that affect this. The industry can have an influence on the species, but of course there are other things too. Like Mr. Gilbert mentioned, there is climate change, and certain insects and natural disasters can also have an impact. We want to be able to save our communities, give jobs to our young people. But we are not unique in this sense. There are ecosystems like this around the world, similar situations, and experts have said that we are losing our natural environment. Up to 75% of birds and mammals are being lost today. And so we need to find a balance, and many times this is quite difficult to find. When we are MPs, we really have to keep this in mind. Will there be a question? Yes, of course. Yes, Ms. Boulian. I know it can be long, but this is his time, and it's up to him to decide how to use it. But I know Mr. Boulris, and I'm sure there will be a question at the end of all this. Yes, of course. In 2016, the government of Quebec stated that they needed to implement a strategy to protect woodland and mountain caribou. Following that, there was an independent commission on mountain caribou that submitted 35 recommendations to the ministry. Mr. Gilbert, I'd like to ask you a question. The first recommendation says that the ministry needs to act as quickly as possible to elaborate and implement a strategy to protect caribou. And they have implemented some administrative measures. They have implemented moratoriums on harvesting in certain areas of mature forests. What do you think about this recommendation, about the question of us needing to protect the caribou? And in your opinion, what would be the best means of protection and which would be the most acceptable for your industry? Yes, thank you for the question. What I would say, firstly, you mentioned the fact that this species could go extinct, which is false. The woodland subspecies in Quebec is actually increasing in number. And we have chosen to protect certain subspecies more specifically, and we won't get into the details of why we made that decision. But when it comes to the strategy, yes, we do need a protection strategy. This order only targets one factor that has an influence on woodland caribou, and that is its habitat. And in protecting this habitat, well, we're actually basing this off of some misconceptions, because the caribou is influenced by a variety of factors, including predators. And I'm sure it's easy to understand that predators are the number one cause of death amongst the woodland caribou ecotype. And there are other factors as well. That being said, currently in this order, they do not address these elements. There are also elements that should be addressed by the the provincial government instead of the federal government. So they need to establish a plan that really works, and to do so, we need to look at all factors, including the most important factor, that being predators.
So now the second round, 5 minutes per committee member and 2.5 minutes for the Bloc and the NDP. So Mr. Martel will start again. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are here today to talk about the threat of the order. That's why we are here today. And I hear you speak. You're talking about predators, about development and management. So what would the order be good for aside from killing the forestry industry? Well, look, that's it. And your question is relevant, Mr. Martel, because in the end, the order is made with a unilateral type of vision. It doesn't take into account the other issues. So we can't get to any other observation than we're heading down the wrong path with this order. And I'd like to add something. When we were talking about solutions earlier, the provincial government, we've worked very hard to have the province understand the issues. And finally, they were aware of the issues. And I want to mention that there were things that were announced just in May. An area of 5,000 square kilometers that would be protected, and it would be doubled to 10,000 square kilometers. 10,000 square kilometers is 20 times the size of the island of Montreal. That's very significant. But it's as if it was nothing. So that's what's perplexing, what's unfortunate. There seems to be a sort of will, like a sort of blind will to protect, and nothing else seems to count. And sometimes the other impacts should be minimized. Our communities are directly affected. And we're going to do like people did 40 years ago. We'll have the same determination to continue with our sector. So if the order appears, Boissaco will be in trouble. And to the mayor. Yes, if the order goes forward as it is proposed today, it's the survival of Boissaco that's called into question. Inaudible. Everything I said earlier. Our young people, those who are a little less young, how will they make a living? They've studied, they've trained to work in the forestry industry, and it would all go to waste. What would happen if it closed? What would happen in Sacré-Cœur? Sacré-Cœur becomes a ghost town, or almost. Mr. Gilbert, climate change here. You sent a letter. Have you talked about climate change? You haven't heard back? We've written 7 letters to Prime Minister Trudeau and to Mr. Guilbeault. We haven't heard back. After the 6th letter, it just says they've received them. But yes, climate change, the question you're asking is important. It's extremely important because, as I was saying, out west, there's research identifying climate change as being the most significant factor in disturbing the woodland ecotype. So increasingly, it's this phenomenon that needs to be addressed. And it's unanimous in the scientific community that the species are going north by 45 kilometers per decade. And a researcher was saying just last year, unfortunately he's passed away, this researcher, but there's recordings on this. He said that regarding climate change, it was inevitable. So moose and deer are going north, and their predators, the wolf, are going north too. And moose populations have gone up 5 times in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and around Pitmokin in the last 20 years. So all of this means there's like a movement that we won't be able to stop easily. It was said that there could be brakes put on climate change in about 300 years, not much before 300 years. That's what he said. So in the short term, a measure on the habitat, destroying forestry in that area, will that help caribou? That's magical thinking. It's wishful thinking. It's impossible. Do I have time left? 10 seconds about. Well, predators, because we've heard about wolves. They're a constant threat. And I read an article about what happened in the West. It's important to talk about this because on wolves, in 2 years, caribou, woodland ecotype caribou forests, caribous have gone up. It hasn't been through the destruction of forestry. Mr. Lozon now. Thank you. I'd like to thank witnesses and the mayor for being here today. I represent a rural region. We have a lot of forestry. A plant is being closed in one of my municipalities, Fortress. You might be aware of it. I was part of the roundtables on this, and that's my background. So I'm familiar with forestry issues. This is not new to see pressure on forestry. Mayor, you know, as a politician at the municipal level, we're close to people, and people depend on the industry. But we've seen some villages and towns suffer, like in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Some industries where citizens mobilized, bought the factory, and tried to get things going again with some conditions. So since '89, there seems to be pressure due to climate change in forestry. There are diseases. You mentioned diseases that exist. It's very interesting. And forest fires. And today, we're facing something else. Above everything else, a defender of forestry, well, we're facing the issue of caribou in Quebec, which is threatened. As part of the government, I'm proud to stand up for the interests of small communities, rural areas. I've worked at the municipal level, Madam Mayor, and I care about serving people and being close to them. But as a government, we need to make decisions through consultations and through professionals. And we're in the process. You're part of the process. That's why we're here. If we didn't want to hear from you, you wouldn't be here today. We're listening to you. It's the time. You talked about a nice document that shows that the caribou isn't threatened in your area. Well, I'd be happy to see that document. I don't have it. I'd like to read it, and I'd like for you to officially table it with this committee so that we can read it and advance the study that is ongoing until September 15th. So, Madam Mayor, you know that the concept of consultation is important in small municipalities, but it's also important at the federal level. And the model we've chosen for consultations, well, it was an independent commission with recommendations from specialists. And that independent commission, you had time to have a look at it, but the mayor didn't. But it's based on your consultations. So the question is for you. Do you think that as a responsible government, our opponents often ask us, they often call for an independent commission for just about every issue. And for this issue, we did do an independent commission. Do you think that it's independent? And how could we do better next time with independent consultations on caribou? Mr. Lozo, you're talking about the current commission? Yes. So currently, this is happening because there was pressure put on the system. I would say that it's very unwieldy to have tried to go forward in a spirit of the threat of an order. The first technical meeting we had to talk about the order, we were told that the order had been prepared to balance protection and impacts on the people in the sector. That's exactly what we were told. Mr. Saint-Gelais, it was extended until September 15th, and we continue to consult you. It's in good faith. I can tell you it's in good faith because we're listening to you. We're here. Mr. Lozon, we were told that what was proposed was the draft and it couldn't change much. Then why do consultations in that spirit? The issues and the impacts on people hadn't been taken into account. And we were told, well, the project won't change much, the draft won't change much, but come talk to us anyways. But come on. This committee, you're saying, I don't know if it was in writing or orally, but you're saying that there was no point, it was already decided, and you already knew the final decision before I, as a federal elected official, I don't know what the final decision is. I still trust in the specialists. You know and I don't. Okay. Mr. Simard, 2.5 minutes. Okay. I'll ask you for very concise answers. Ms. Boulian, we're trying to influence the minister today. In 1 minute, would you have something to say to Mr. Guilbeault, a message for him very quickly? Earlier, I mixed up the issue of consultation. So yes, we are participating in the consultation currently. All of my citizens have received a personal message to encourage them to respond to that consultation. And the message I want to give today is that if the order passes as it is proposed now, well, I wonder what will happen to our municipality. I don't think they'll need a mayor for that municipality anymore because there will be nothing to manage anymore. It's very clear. Thank you. Mr. Saint-Gelais, perhaps you can continue responding to Mr. Lozon if you wish, but I want to talk about the rate of disturbance. 35% for the rate of disturbance, and if you include forest fires and the eastern spruce budworm, the sector, well, it would be 58% for the rate of disturbance. Could you tell us more about that? I'll ask Andre. Just to rectify, in Pitmoakan, it's 80% disturbance currently. Those are the calculations that were done with the federal methodology. We've used the goals of the order and done the calculations with our experts on what could happen if the order went forward. And taking down all of the rows we could, and then it would be 49% of the rate of disturbance. The goal of the order is 35%. At 35%, well, 70% chances to have the population stay the same, but 49% wouldn't achieve that. So the order, the way it was made, looking just at habitat and not recognizing what the territory is like where we manage the forest, well, it's just wishful thinking. There won't be the effect they hope for. So it would destroy economies and lives for nothing. So in consultation, Mr. Saint-Gelais, your capacity to influence the government's decision, you thought it was minimal. That's the sense of the conversation you had with Mr. Lauzon. So I'd like to hear about that very briefly, please. Look, at the first meeting, when we received the information, when it said, this is the order, there would be catastrophic impacts and it can't change much, so it didn't leave much hope. We continue to express ourselves in all possible ways. Mr. Boulris. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to say that I like the story of Boisseco, people from the community who take things in hand and who have collective ownership. For someone like me in the NDP, that really speaks to me. That's a story that I find moving, that I care about. And I think it could be a model in many other areas and for organizing labor. I'm a little torn. I have information that seems contradictory. Boisseco says you can't just preserve things. It won't work. But the species seems threatened or fragile in many ways. So I'd like to hear, in a spirit of finding solutions, what could be done to improve the situation currently that would be acceptable for you? I don't think we can just say we need to keep the status quo. But what could be done, in your opinion, that would be a step in the right direction, but that would also be acceptable for your workers? Well, we need to work with all of the information. What we've always suggested is that the solution go through coordination. We have to understand all of the issues. Controlling predators has to be part of a strategy in one way or another. We could adapt things on when we work. There are many things that can be done. We've suggested many solutions to the government of Quebec. It can't be done in just any way or in a rushed way. There are many stakeholders involved. First Nations, there are many stakeholders. When we say the solution has to be about coordination, that's what we mean. There can't be a steamroller pushing one solution. We need to have the capacity to establish the right solutions to have real impacts on the subspecies present in Quebec and for the woodland caribou. And that's what I really want to say. There's just one subspecies in Quebec. It's the woodland or boreal caribou. And that's where there are concerns. But caribou overall in Quebec is not threatened. Okay, thank you, Mr. Martel. Listen. First, the order is disastrous for the region, for communities. That's what I'm retaining from what we've discussed today. People could lose their jobs if the order is imposed. They won't have food on the table. Being able to have a roof over their head, that will be difficult for many. That's what's threatened currently. I'd like to know one thing. Has everything been done currently? Have all actions been taken? Has everything been done currently? Everything been done for Has everything been done to take into consideration that the order should be imposed? Well, look, what we believe is that with what the provincial government announced recently, with what's already being discussed, we know there are discussions already being held to work on solutions. We've proposed solutions. The provincial government is analyzing, reflecting, and suggesting more solutions. So we need to be able to establish solutions that will take into account all of the facts and issues. So that is the solution. That's what we need to do. Take into account all of the facts and the issues. We need to take the time to do it well, to not rush forward with an order that didn't take into account any of the other impacts. So that's what I could answer. Thanks. That's all for my questions. Thank you, Mr. Martel. Ms. Shanahan, we will conclude with you. We'll conclude the first panel with you. You have 5 minutes. Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to confirm, Mr. Chair, has the request been put forward for the documents mentioned by the witnesses earlier with my colleague, Mr. Lauzon, and Ms. Châtel regarding the numbers on caribou? They have documents apparently that show that they're not in decline. Have we made that request? You're asking that our witnesses submit the documents showing that the species is not in decline? Is that correct? Yes. Yes. What the witnesses mentioned. We don't have those documents, but we invite the witnesses to send those documents to us. Yes. Excellent. Because, as our colleagues have already said, it's very important that we work together in a collaborative way with all of the facts before us. I'd like to address my first question to Boissaco. We recognize the leadership you've shown for the economic prosperity of regional communities, but like any company, you need certainty, right? For your resources, for your market. The question I have for you is, do you find that the absence of concrete policies to address caribou here in Quebec is a challenge for you? Does that contribute to uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty that you face, that your industry faces?
Je vous dirais, Madame.
Ms. Chalan, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Yes. So what's clear is that uncertainty is always harmful. Like I said, over the past 4 years, we've been able to work intensively to ensure that the provincial government understands the importance of measured, clear, intentional decisions. And we've been working to find solutions together. But with this order, I would say we're back at square one. Because when they announce this type of order, this could mean that they can force their hand over the situation. So we're already facing the impacts of these things because we have entrepreneurs who are asking us questions, asking if they should start looking elsewhere, if we face problems, also with clients. I'm sorry, I apologize, I have to interrupt. It's just that we know that the government of Quebec has spoken of establishing a strategy since 2016. But we're here to work in a collaborative manner. We want to put aside ideologies and different jurisdictions to find a proper solution that will be a balance between conserving caribou as well as meeting regional needs, economic needs. Do you recognize the fact that the province does have an important role to play in this issue? What we're saying is that we need to set aside this order, put an end to it. And then we need to continue to work together with the governments. We're not here to do politics. We have bigger problems to deal with other than politics. So, yes, we want an environment where we are all working hand in hand to find solutions that will help us in the future to protect the caribou, protect the forest, and protect our industry. So that's our goal. But in order to do that, we need to set aside this threat of the order that really is bringing us back to square one, if you understand what I mean. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Saint-Gelais. Thank you. So that's the end of our first panel. Mr. Chair, if you'd allow me, I think that this is an essential element. I would just like Bosako to tell us if the order would affect 60% of their current volumes, and if they lost 20% of their current volumes, they would actually see an 80% reduction in their benefits. I will ask Bosako to send you that in written format if they have that information. In written form, rather. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their very eloquent speeches and the information that they shared. So we're going to start again. Welcome, Mr. Picard, to our committee. A pleasure to have you here. We also have a second witness, Mr. Alain Bédard, online, but he is facing some technical difficulties that we're trying to fix right now. So we will begin with Chief Picard. The floor is yours. Yes, hello everyone. Allow me to firstly recognize that we are situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, and I'd like to thank them for bringing us together today for this very important discussion and an issue that has an impact on this nation and not only them. Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, my name is Gilles Picard. I am the chief of the Innu Nation and the chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Quebec, Labrador. Our organization brings together the 43 First Nations communities in Quebec and Labrador, and its mission is to ensure the protection of their rights in a wide range of important issues. I'd like to begin by thanking you for the invitation to speak today about the cultural, spiritual, and long-standing relationship between First Nations peoples and the Caribou, or Atik in Innu language. I would like to speak of our support for Minister Guilbeault's desire to adopt an emergency decree, or order rather, under the Species at Risk Act. Caribou are at the heart of First Nations identity, culture, and way of life. We are not simply stakeholders in the management of the territory and its resources. We are rights holders and demand to be involved in the decision-making processes related to our territories. As mentioned, First Nations are holders of treaty rights. And I'd like to remind everyone that these rights are formalized in the United Nations Declaration of Rights, or UNDRIP, and have been endorsed by the Government of Canada through the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Today, Quebec persists in refusing to adopt a provincial law that would endorse UNDRIP at the Quebec level and force it to adapt its legislative framework to its founding principles. We are aware and care about the socioeconomic issues surrounding the protection of caribou, particularly with regard to forestry jobs and the survival of the municipalities that survive upon them. Despite these concerns, we agree with many that urgent action is needed to protect caribou, an umbrella species that is essential to the health of our ecosystems and the biodiversity that inhabits them. In this sense, we reaffirm our support for Minister Guilbeault and his actions, which flow directly from his legal obligation to recommend an emergency order when he considers that the species is exposed to imminent threats to its survival or its recovery. In our opening notes, we stated that we should not be blaming Mr. Guilbeault and playing the interference card by arguing that the preservation of the species falls under Quebec's jurisdiction. If we find ourselves in this precarious situation today, it's entirely due to the Quebec government's inaction on this matter. Since 2019, it has been postponing the publication of a comprehensive strategy that would contribute to the survival of all caribou herds in Quebec. The Quebec Superior Court went even further last June, ruling that the Quebec government had failed to fulfill its constitutional obligation to the First Nations of Esipit, Pekimanu Luntach, Tanikahan, and by failing to consult with them prior to the development of this same strategy. The same judgment also highlights Quebec's inaction and the urgent need to act. And I quote, "Given the deplorable situation of the caribou on Quebec's territory and its habitat in Nitassinan." End of quote. Quebec's First Nations take the caribou survival to heart, and we have been working for several years to preserve it, whether that be through political action, participation in various political committees, or roundtables, as well as through various grassroots initiatives led by the communities themselves. The ANFQL even went as far as to submit a brief outlining our concerns and recommendations to the independent commission set up by Quebec itself in 2022. In spite of all this, the government of Quebec persists in excluding First Nations from all decision-making related to caribou. Faced with its refusal to cooperate, the First Nations called on the federal government to intervene in accordance with its legal obligation. Minister Guilbeault was the only one to take our concerns and propose solutions seriously. Hence, our support for his recommendation to the Governor and Council to adopt an emergency order for the protection of caribou. In conclusion, we believe that the major action must be taken to ensure that caribous survive, and we urge you all to put your seal of approval on the emergency order process, which stems from the Minister of the Environment's legal obligation to act. The fate of caribou must be the subject of action and discussion that go beyond political partisanship. And the same principle should apply when it comes to Indigenous issues on a broader scale. It's also important to act to correct the misinformation campaign currently underway in Quebec and to base our actions on reliable data that are the subject of a scientific consensus. We must act quickly, not only for caribou, but so that our children, who will form future generations, can also see the greatness and importance of this iconic species and benefit from the immeasurable ecosystem services provided by forests and their biodiversity. I'd also, of course, like to recognize Mr. Bédard, who is the director of our Sustainable Development Organization in Quebec, who is also with us here this morning. Thank you, Chief Picard. I'm not sure that we have managed to fix the technical problems. It seems not for Mr. Bédard. Mr. Bédard, feel free to send any written messages you'd like to us. And I can communicate those to the group so that you'll be able to participate in the discussion. We can ask you questions as well, but unfortunately, if the system is not working properly, then you are limited to yes or no, for or against. But members are free to ask you questions. But like I said, please feel free to send us written comments, sharing any reactions that you may have to what is shared today. So let's begin with our question period. Mr. Deltal is our first speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, colleagues. Chief Picard, it's nice to see you here in Ottawa. We're nearly neighbors because your offices are in Wendake, and I have the privilege of having been born near Wendake 60 years ago, and I've spent my life in that area. So I have close ties with the Wendat and First Nations, and I'm very proud of that. And welcome to the Canadian Parliament, Chief Picard. I'd also like to talk about Wendake, if you'll allow me to. I represent them. I've represented them for 16 years. Wendake is an inspiration for all First Nations. It's a nation that is proud of its heritage and that's very autonomous economically. Over 400 non-Indigenous people work in Wendake. There are flourishing companies throughout Canada that are present in Wendake, and many of them work with wood, whether it's canoes by Christian Picard, artisanal snowshoes from Gros Louis that I have at home, GV snowshoes, and Primotext, a company founded by the Siwi family about 40 years ago, about 50 employees, and they build stairs with wood. Why do I mention this? Because, yes, there can be a good balance of the economic vitality and the vitality of animals on the land. Mr. Picard, you said earlier that caribou is very important to you. It's very important to First Nations. Can you tell us more about that? I was focusing on the importance of caribou, and I would say, in addition, our world is very inclusive. There's a human person, and there's everything that's around us. There's vegetation and animals. It's very important to mention that. It's something we insist on every time we have the opportunity to do so. That being said, caribou is at the heart of our concerns. It's true for Inus, for the Cree nations, and I'm sure it would be the same thing in the Yukon. At the same time, we are very well aware that with the leaders of these nations, there is a fragility with caribou herds. We're fully aware of that, and actions have been taken to show that our nations are also proactive. We understand the fragility of the balance between the economic survival, generally speaking, and the fragility of ecosystems. 2 years ago, the Cree and Innu nations started working together and decided to put together their concerns. They're in an agreement between those two nations. And so there's harvesting that's possible because caribou is very present and important for subsistence hunting. And those two nations agreed, and in January, February, it will be 2 years, that there's been collaboration that's been made official between these two nations for harvesting and conservation of the species. And to me, that shows that our nations, regardless of the roles of the two other levels of government, that our nations are able to put in place the means to foster policies to protect the species. So I think there's one aspect that's very important of the close tie between the caribou and our nations, but there's also the issues that are a little bit more contemporary that are also important to us. There's a community with the Innu Nation that recently decided to abstain from hunting for a period of, I believe, 5 years to try to allow caribou herds to increase to a level that's much less concerning than today. Mr. Picard, I have a question and I'd like you to answer perhaps later. But earlier we had people from Boissaco and Sacré-Cœur who talked about something that happened in British Columbia and Alberta. In about 2 years, there was an increase in the caribou herd by allowing hunting that was for wolves. Is that something that should be contemplated? If you don't have time, we can talk about that later, but I'd like for you to reflect on that. Well, listen, just quickly, I think what's clear with your question, if there's no space to talk about it, well, solutions are not proposed. And that's what I think we need to be doing here today. I referred to the Superior Court decision for the case of 2 of our communities where Quebec didn't fully exercise its role in consulting our communities and their leaders. And that's what I want to highlight today in regards to your question. If we're not able to create that space, well then the discussions are meaningless. Mr. Vancouverton.
Mr. Vancouver. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for their points of view and their testimony today. I will begin this afternoon by recognizing that my riding here in Milton is far from the issue of caribou. Milton is on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississauga of the First Credit. We're very close to the Confederation of Six Nations, but as the Parliamentary Secretary, it is my responsibility to support the government's work on this file. In the previous testimony, we heard that caribou populations were not in danger, and that in fact their numbers were increasing. Chief Picard, based on your experience, your observations, are boreal caribou populations in good health? Are they increasing? Do science and research support what they said, that caribou herds are in good health and are improving currently?
Écoutez, un des gestes.
Listen, one of the actions we supported by the government of Quebec is setting up an advisory committee that was going to study the issue, and in general, the conclusions of that committee, which were presented in a report submitted at the end of summer 2022. Well, we supported that, and that's one point of scientific data. And in light of what we've received as information over the past year, I think without a doubt there are statements that need to be supported by the scientific community. I think it's unfortunate that Mr. Bédard is unable to fully participate because the scientific portion is about sustainable development and his expertise. But at the risk of repeating myself, I'll take up what I was saying to Mr. Deltel a little earlier. If we're not able to create that space, these discussions are isolated and don't allow for stronger collaboration in looking for solutions. We believe it would have been possible to put all of the interests related to the fragility of the species around one table and have that discussion. And it seems that the scientific community should have been called to contribute as well. The question that you've asked, in my opinion, well, it's still possible to find that information.
Merci, Chef Pic.
Thank you, Chief Picard. I appreciate your answer. Mr. Bédard, is it possible, with a thumbs up or down, to indicate in what direction populations of caribou are going right now over the last 10 years? Mr. Bédard will try, perhaps go ahead, and we'll see if the sound quality is sufficient. So go ahead, and I may need to interrupt you if it doesn't work. Unfortunately, sound quality is not sufficient for interpretation.
Historique au niveau du caribou. Là, l'espèce a été inscrit sur la loi des espèces en péril, la loi sur les espèces menacées et vulnérables.
Excusez-moi,
Excuse me, there's no interpretation. It's because the sound quality is not sufficient, if I've understood correctly. So unfortunately, you'll have to put that in writing for us, Mr. Bidar. I'm sorry. But we have to take care of our interpreters. But feel free to send us things in writing that will help with our report. We'll be glad to receive your comments.
Merci.
Merci, Monsieur
30
Président.
seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Question.
My final question is very brief. Is it fair or reasonable for the provincial government to take more than 8 years to prepare a plan to support and conserve caribou species? Chief Picard, briefly, please. Do you think 8 years is enough to put in place a plan? Is that correct, Mr. Vancouverden?
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think 8 years is much too long. And there's a fragility that requires urgency in action. We've said that a couple of times in my opening remarks, and we've said it outside of this committee as well. We've said it to the advisory committee that I referred to earlier. Very specific recommendations on this in the report. Mr. Simard. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Chief Picard. I understand from your opening remarks, you've said that interference wasn't valid here. To talk about that, maybe we have some disagreements on that, but I've always had a lot of admiration for First Nations who fought tooth and nail for their land and everything that includes, as the government of Quebec does. You had a favorable decision from the Superior Court of Quebec that required the government to consult you. Your support for the order, could it change over time based on consultation with Quebec? Well, of course, Chief Dominic, who you're meeting later, if I've understood correctly, will have a more fulsome answer than mine, because it's really his community and Spit that have been the subject of the decision by the Superior Court. In fact, we're just asking to collaborate, especially on this issue, because we have communities, many communities, that are asking to participate. What I'd like to specify is that the Quebec Labrador, the association, has a duty to bring people together and to highlight files that are more urgent than others, and it's true for caribou. So we're going forward with a stance that allows us to reflect the diversity represented by 10 nations and about 40 communities. We've indicated, based on the decision by the Superior Court, that we want to meet with as many ministers from the government of Quebec who are involved in the principle of consultation. We're awaiting answers from Quebec on this, and we've always indicated that it's important that it be sooner rather than later. So on this issue, the ball is really in Quebec's court. If we have a framework that allows us to not be subordinated to conditions put forward just by the government of Quebec. I think the political will on our side can certainly be there. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. I was glad to hear you talk about the principle of bringing people together, because I have the impression, when I look at media and discussions I've had with certain people, that there's no consensus on caribou protection. It's difficult to find. We've worked on this issue for 3 or 4 years. We've had meetings with people, and it's very difficult to reach a consensus or a position that would have a majority of stakeholders, whether it's people from the forestry sector or people who are for the protection of biodiversity. I think we can bring the two together, but I'd like to know, with different Indigenous communities, is there a majority point of view that you could express? And my idea is not to polarize things, but I've listened to different media statements from people who are employees of Boissaco, among others, who had maybe a different vision. So what would be the point of view that's a consensus among First Nations? Perhaps I'll add something to try to answer your question. From what I've heard from public meetings held in Sacré-Cœur, Forestville, which is close to where I live, I have to admit that some of the comments expressed were concerning to me and counterproductive for the goal. And I think it is important to insist on the fact that conditions have to be there to allow for a proactive discussion, a constructive discussion concerning the situation before us. At the risk of repeating myself, insofar as the government of Quebec is ready to listen to us, I think the will on our side is there. The comparison I could make between the intervention of Minister Guilbeault, the federal government, from the outset, they've called on First Nations and said, look, I intend to listen to you, not to compare with the action or inaction of the government of Quebec. And that's what's highlighted here, I think. The fact that the government of Quebec is taking action that could potentially allow things to go in a negative direction. If we had the necessary space to begin a discussion that's constructive, I think First Nations, I don't see how First Nations wouldn't take that opportunity. Thank you. Mr. Boulidis, over to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to our witnesses. Chief Picard, it's always a pleasure to hear from you. I'm very honored to be able to ask you a few questions today. Mr. Bedard, I would have liked to hear from you. Perhaps I'll ask questions directly and you can answer them afterward in writing. Chief Picard, at the outset, you mentioned something, and I'd like to hear you elaborate on the role of caribou in the culture of certain Indigenous nations, for the way of life, for identity as well. Caribou, aside from a balance in the ecosystem, what can caribou symbolize for your nations? I'd like to learn more about that.
I was talking of the caribou as an emblem, as a symbol for our culture. In fact, I was present when the Innu and Cree nations met for the first time in Metsinakouche, near Shefferville, in Shefferville Bay. That was back in February 2023. Caribou was at the heart of the discussions, but also it was the main topic it was quite easy for these two nations to give both of them measures that allow them to have a good harvest, which is based on the principle of conservation, but that allow our communities to hunt for food. But caribou is in the same category as the bear. There is a spiritual connection between the bear and many societies around the globe. This has been demonstrated many times over. For the Innu communities, for the Atikamekw community, for the Anishinaabe community, caribou has always been paramount, whether it be in the legends, whether it be for food, of course, we all need to overcome that environmental challenge. That's why we want to act in the face of this imminent decline that increases the precarity of our communities. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's important to hear you on this, to hear you speak about all this traditional knowledge. Reconciliation cannot just be a simple slogan. Same goes for the protection of diversity. It's not just the responsibility of Brazil, Costa Rica, or Kenya. We also have a responsibility here to act when there are real threats, real proven threats. Regarding consultation and the role of the government of Quebec, the Quebec government said in 2016 that there needs to be a strategy to protect caribou. It's been 8 years now, and I was troubled to see on June 21st when the Superior Court of Quebec said that consultations were not done accordingly with the indigenous communities that were affected. I find that to be troubling. So my question is, what is the responsibility, what is the role that the federal government can play in this context, especially considering the Species at Risk Act? If I may, I will also add that the matter of the caribou has for the longest time been at the heart of our preoccupations, of our worries. And as an aside, I will say that a former Quebec premier said back in the day that he was not ready to sacrifice jobs for a few caribous. So this is quite worrisome, and I fully agree with you on this. In fact, I was referring to that earlier. I believe it is our duty to create this space to foster discussion, to better specify what we mean by consultation. What the federal government believes to be consultation may be different from other interveners. Minister Guilbeault, the Minister for Environment, spoke directly to the First Nations about that, and that's been welcomed. I believe that we've had 3 meetings with the department that have allowed the communities to better understand the objectives behind the order, that allowed us to voice our concerns. And if I compare that way of doing things compared to the government of Quebec, I can say that the government of Quebec did not give us as many opportunities to voice our concerns. I believe that the announcement of that strategy was delayed for reasons that are not valid. If we're as worried as some say, well, why don't we have a process by which we create this space for discussion for all interveners, including the forest industry? But instead of fostering that space, We're all subject to this kind of disinformation that helps no one. Mr. Deltel, 5 minutes. So, Mr. Picard, let's go back to our earlier conversation. What do you believe of what happened? What do you think of what happened 15 years ago in BC and Alberta, where we allowed wolves to hunt, and we also increased the numbers of caribou by 50%? Is that a solution? It can be a solution, but we need to debate this between interveners. I was talking about this Innu community that has a local policy in the hopes that the caribou numbers will increase. That was a community decision that and other communities may follow suit. We need to do surveillance. We need to see what's going on in the forests, and we need to put in place some solutions that can bear fruit. If we allowed wolves to hunt who are predators, and if we increased the numbers, it could inspire us here and do the same thing. Well, I'm from Pissamit, and that's the Picmogan Reservoir, which was part of a local initiative that is to modify so that it becomes a protected area. And the people who were there told me that there were quite a few concerns regarding the number of wolves. So we'll need to talk about that. So that's a good basis for discussion, Chief Picard. Tell me, are there First Nations people who work in the wood industry and who would be directly impacted by this order? Answer: there certainly is a part of the population that do work in that industry. I believe that community leaders should have this discussion with them. And what would you answer to these First Nations community members who would see their jobs jeopardized by this federal order? My answer is, let's speak to their... Well, you're the chief of the Assembly of First Nations. What do you have to tell their... Well, I'm not a chief of chiefs, sir. What I was saying earlier, sir, is that I have the responsibility to promote the consensus among my members. And there is consensus around the difficult equilibrium to strike between conservation and the economy. All right, so you're the chief of First Nations in Quebec, and earlier you heard a mayor, Ms. Boulian, mayor for Sacré-Cœur, who told us that should the Liberal order go ahead, that her town would become a ghost town. What is your answer to that? Answer: back in the day, there was the Kruger Company. They're not there anymore. And we said that about Kruger earlier. And despite the fact that the Kruger is not in operation anymore, communities are still thriving today. That's what I was saying earlier. We can all be victims of disinformation, and that hinders our capacity to make decisions that benefit everyone, and that's a challenge we're all faced with today. Earlier, people from Boissaco said that jobs could there could be job loss, and that, of course, this affects human dignity. Do you agree to that? That if somebody loses their job, it affects human dignity? Answer: our human dignity has been affected for decades now, sir, and that is related to the fact that we are not decision makers, and we need to be able to make decisions in this file. But in this case, there are First Nations that might lose their jobs. There's a mayor who says that her town will become a ghost town, and a company that says that there will be a job loss, which will lead to an affront to human dignity. That's the reality. While the reality is that what is stated today is not supported scientifically. This job loss, how many job loss are we talking about? 2,000? job losses? We don't know exactly. The government of Quebec is not taking part in a discussion that is paramount for many communities, including ours. And that's what we want to say here today. Shouldn't the government of Quebec play the role that it needs to play here today? That's all we're saying today. We're not against having a discussion that is constructive, as long as we give us a chance to speak our mind to this. Thank you. Now we go to Ms. Châtel. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This was a very fascinating discussion. Thank you for testimony. We're talking about the caribou today, but we're also talking about biodiversity and species at risk. And one of my constituents was asking me, why is this so important? Well, it's important because biodiversity supports us, all of us, and including our economy. By protecting our biodiversity, we protect our health, we protect our economy, we protect our well-being today, but tomorrow as well. That's why we need to have the discussion. Otherwise, our environment will deteriorate, and we're part of the environment, and the economy is part of the environment. So thank you for speaking about this disinformation, because there is some fear-mongering. However, all we want is to have a solution that will protect our environment. Our environment that supports our economy and that supports our human dignity and the dignity of our children for the next generation. So you were talking about disinformation earlier, sir, and I was remembering one of the forest companies that was saying that, no, it's not true, that the boreal caribou is not endangered, it's not imperiled. But there's an independent committee that authored an independent report. It's the Committee on the Situation of Species at Risk in Canada, and there were biology experts on that committee, academics, people from the public service, people from NGOs, and people from the private sector. So, obviously, science has spoken in this regard. And this is not anything new. This has been going on for years now. We've been talking about this species since 2004. And it's been 20 years, so that's why we need to act today. Because we have not been listening to scientists since 2004. But a few years ago, the Quebec government was asked to prepare a plan to protect the caribou, which is something that the federal government has been asking as well. Has there been any result from this request? Well, my answer is simple to that, Ms. Châtel. The ball is in the court of the government of Quebec. There were two recommendations connected to First Nations. The Commission recommends that the strategy that the government will have to develop takes into account the value attached to caribou by First Nations, takes into account traditional knowledge and ancestral rights that can be affected. Second recommendation, that government implements as soon as possible formal discussions with these communities on a nation-to-nation basis in the hopes of respecting its duty, its constitutional duty to consult. And there's been a decision rendered by the Superior Court back in June, which certainly goes against the recommendations that were formulated earlier. You had to go to court to be consulted? Am I getting this right? Unfortunately, when the political process fails, despite the good faith of First Nations in negotiations, often First Nations are faced with a sole option left, that is to go before the courts. As an aside, back in February, the Supreme Court issued its decision when the Quebec government was stating that C-92 was infringing on provincial rights, despite the fact we're talking about our children, our families, and the Supreme Court issued a decision that went in our favor. Obviously, there's been disagreements between our constituents and the Quebec government for at least 50 years now. So this emergency order, it's only in case there's an emergency, and I believe that's where we're at. We've been trying to act, we've been trying to plan alongside the province of Quebec. Do you believe that there's been a lack of leadership from the province of Quebec? A very brief answer, Chief, please. Obviously, there's been... Yes. Well, that's pretty clear. Mr. Simard. I would just like to go back to what you said earlier on the closing of the Kruger company. I have a friend who texted me who had to move after that company shut its operations. There's a closing of Console in L'Abbé. And this was studied at length at l'Université du Québec at Chicoutimi. We studied the effects of what happens when these types of companies shut their operations down. And the results are stark. There are impacts. And I believe that should those companies close shop, there would be catastrophic impacts on the community. But I don't want to belabor the point. I have a question for Mr. Simard, who can maybe write his answer to us. The people from Boissaco earlier said that because of the eastern spruce budworm, because of the forest fires, the ecosystem may not be favorable to the woodland caribou anymore. Could you give us a written answer to my question? Thank you. It's quite appreciated. Chief Picard, I understand that you insisted on the fact that your role is to find consensus among your community or among your communities. But I'll be quite frank. Has there been any work done to gather the impression of people who could lose their jobs because of that? I know there are Indigenous-led businesses as well. Because, well, to keep things simple, we know that in the forest industry, well, there can always be a chain reaction. Should something happen somewhere, this could have an impact elsewhere. So this chain reaction, if something happens to one part of the industry, this could affect other parts of the industry, and therefore, this will also affect Indigenous-led businesses. Do you have any information in that regard? Yes, very briefly, and Mr. Boulris will have a few questions for you as well, so we can answer Mr. Simard's question during Mr. Boulris's time if he doesn't object to that. Yes, but my questions are much more relevant than Mr. Boulris's question, says Mr. Simard. Well, I won't go down that route, says the chair. So very briefly, please, Mr. Picard, very briefly.
Well, I could come back to some examples that show that the communities are managing to find this delicate balance that we've been speaking of between conservation, protection, and the economy. And I will be present for a very important announcement in one of the communities that will be speaking of the forestry industry. Mr. Boulris, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd quickly like to say to Mr. Simard that I disagree on his one of his opinions. I would like to apologize sincerely. And very quickly, I'd like to say that having a job, a salary, is a question of dignity for families. But we have no economy without our environment. I think it's important to remember that, so we have a responsibility to our environment as well. Mr. Picard, you spoke of certain recommendations from the 2022 Independent Committee. I'd like to come back to recommendation number 9. I have a question on this. So it proposed creating a protected area in Pipmoacan and an indigenous-led protected area as well. And they held discussions with the community to offer technical and financial support. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. What has been done since this recommendation? Has progress been made? Has anything been implemented? I would say that there's always a certain slowdown related to administrative processes surrounding the communities. I remember in 2020, the Pessimit community said that they tabled a project for a protected area, and it took several months for them to have any type of reaction from the government of Quebec. Other than that, it was radio silence. But the community is happy to receive or to hear of the intentions of the government of Quebec and its personal commitment to increase the spread of protected areas in Quebec. Now, I think that there has been degradation of the relationship with the government of Quebec in certain areas. It makes me think of the decision from the Supreme Court. Time is short for the caribou, and time is short for finding a common solution following consultations with the government. Thank you. Mr. Daltel, 5 minutes. So we've spoken of something that is fundamental to what's happening right now. We need to take into account protecting wildlife and protecting jobs at the same time. So an honest question, Mr. Picard. For those who risk to lose their job, what message would you like to share with them? The only message that I would say would be constructive and responsible to share is to bring everyone around the same table. We can take the community of Esipit. They are completely open to these discussions, but when the conditions are not right, when the participating parties have not been able to determine the conditions of the discussion themselves, it's difficult for them to participate in the discussion. In Sacré-Cœur, Côte-Nord, Forestville, and other places, what I've seen and heard is concerning. That meaning that they do not have the proper conditions to hold these discussions. What's encouraging is that the different parties agree on the important aspects of what needs to be done. In terms of a consensus, it's been 12 years now that we're trying to evaluate some of the main principles surrounding land and resources. There are 4 large themes, and one of those essential themes is conservation. So, to the extent possible, I don't see why there would be a decline in commitment to these discussions. I'd like to come back to a concrete solution. And we have an example of a 51% increase over 2 years, which really shows how effective this is. So you spoke to me of this earlier. Would you be ready to promote the solution to the federal government and the provincial government so that we can protect jobs, and wildlife. Could you speak to me about this? I feel that I have to promote this because this solution has been confirmed by our traditional communities. Are you going to speak to them about this? I think that the report of today's session will contribute to this discussion. I'm happy that we were able to find common ground. Thank you, Mr. Picard. Mr. Loison. Thank you, Chief Picard, for your presence here today, for answering our questions. You talked about the forestry sector. You talked about misinformation. We, over the years, have felt the pressure to establish sustainable measures in the forestry industry. I've worked with Canada International Paper, the companies in the Pacific, Stembeck, Fortress, in my writing, amongst other companies that have closed. And right now we're facing disinformation on the topic of protecting caribou. Could you speak about this? It seems we're talking a lot about the economy, new technology, the digital world. But today we're speaking more of protecting the caribou. So could you speak further to us about this? So we're talking more about the caribou because they're in a precarious situation. And this is supported by the scientific community. But clearly the forestry industry has a considerable impact on the ecosystem. That's why we need to talk about it. You talked about Tembec in Témiscamingue. I know that they had a relationship with First Nations communities, and as far as I've always heard, it was a positive relationship. I was talking to you about an announcement that's happening later this week. It's an announcement related to cogeneration. And this is in an area that also depends greatly on the forestry industry, with the use of byproducts, with hardwood lumber, for example. Yeah, so I think that there are communities that are managing to offer solutions to finding this fragile balance between the economy and conservation. I think that this shows that we're called to contribute the traditional knowledge of our communities, and they're willing to do this. So we're trying to reorganize the industry. We can see what's happening with the oil industry, electrification. We're looking to innovate and develop new projects and really change the industry on a dime. Do you think that this is what we should be doing? It makes me think of a cover of National Geographic that said, "The future is Indigenous." And I think we need to give them the opportunity to create this future. So we have a lot to gain from our First Nations, but we need to offer them this opportunity to do so. Mr. Chair, if I have the time, you mentioned several times, you talked about reliable scientific data. Why is it important that we focus on this? In your consultations, were you able to find and consult data and documents that show the reliability of our system surrounding the caribou? Well, you spoke earlier of the challenges that we all face. And that we need to turn on a dime because of these changes, and that's the reality that we face in my region. We need to be involved in the discussion, and I think consultation is essential here when we face these challenges. We're receiving so many requests asking for our opinions, and what we want to do is to be able to share the most reliable data possible. We do have limited capacity, however, and we're not all on equal footing. Well, I'd invite you to share any documents that you have with us that would support your community. Thank you, Chief Picard, for being here with us. Mr. Bedard, I apologize for the technical difficulties. But as you were able to see, there is a lot of interest in your perspective, so if you would be able to send us a document in written format, that would help support our report and our final conclusions. So we will take a brief break before we return for the last hour. Thank you.
recommence.
Okay, we are going to begin again. We have Louis Pelletier, Head Forester of the Office of the Chief Forester of Quebec. We have Chantier Chibougamau with Frédéric Véraud, Executive Director, Corporate Development. From the Quebec Forest Industry Council, we have the pleasure of welcoming the President and Chief Executive Officer, Jean-François Samret. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your names perfectly. From the nation Pequot Camul-Noach, Takuirkan, we have Chief Gilbert Dominique, who is online. So we will begin with Mr. Pelletier. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, fellow witnesses. So what is our mandate here at the Office of the Chief Forester? So we are guided by our laws in the forestry industry. Our first mission is to determine the production possibilities of the forest in Quebec. We do analysis work and we inform the Quebec population on what we're doing and what the state is doing in the forestry industry. So what are forestry opportunities? So this is the maximum volume that we can harvest on our land in function with the evolution of the land and taking into account our sustainable development goals. So once we do this analysis, the chief forester gives this to the minister, who is responsible for forest management. We also advise the minister on different issues. That could be forest planning, activities to optimize forest management, and any issues that we feel involve the government. And so we have been working on the topic of the caribou.
The minister can ask us to carry out a mandate and ask for our advice on any matter for private forests and public forests. A point that's important for your information is that the chief forester has a view to sustainable development and the independence under the current law. This independence is expressed in different ways. Its own strategic plan, a website that's different from the ministry's. We manage our own communications, we produce our reports, and we make our decisions without interference. We also have the power to investigate. We have immunity under the Act. When there was the emergency order issued after the announcement by the federal government that the emergency order was planned to protect the Caribou Val d'Or, Charlevoix, Picmocan, of our own initiative, we began analyzing the impact on forestry. Our analysis was on provisional zones. These were set out by the federal government. In these provisional areas, there's no forestry or harvesting allowed. The method we used, well, since there's no forestry, that's what we would use when we do an impact analysis for protected areas, strict protected areas. So no adjustment to forestry strategies, and without information on how the future would go, the mountain caribou for this period are maintained. This information is in the documents that I've submitted. In our impact analysis, we've seen that the accessibility for some land could be compromised because some land is surrounded by provisional zones, and so there could be isolation and additional impacts on the forestry sector. And in zones of interest that were not analyzed by us, because during consultations, provisional zones can extend to interest zones, but we've done our work only with publicly known limits. And so if there are restrictions to interest zones in relation to provisional zones to decrease harvesting or forestry, well, the impact would be different, of course. So in the provisional zones, it's 1.6 million hectares that were analyzed. Of that 1.6 million hectares, 1.2 are part of, or could possibly be harvested in forestry. That's 4 regions: Abitibi-Témiscamingue, for the Val d'Or herd, the national capital for the Charlevoix herd, and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and Côte-Nord for Piquemocan. So the impact on forestry potential in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, 562,000 cubic meters. You're over your time, Mr. Pelletier. I'll give you another 15 seconds to conclude, and then you can answer questions. That will be my pleasure. Thank you. 562,000 cubic meters for Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, 246,000 cubic meters for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, and further amount for the Côte-Nord. As I mentioned, to conclude, there are still unknowns. So how things would be done in interest zones, that will be defined later, that could have an impact. And the final contour of the provisional areas. So the results of our impact analysis could change. Thank you. Mr. Vero. Thank you, members of the committee, fellow witnesses. Thank you for taking this time to talk about the boreal caribou. We want to see its recovery, and we're also concerned about impacts on our company and on the people of Quebec, the people of Canada. So to talk to you about Chantier Chibougamau Family Company, founded in 1961. There are 1,500 people who are employed by us. We cut trees down and transform them into building materials, packing materials, and renewable energy to decarbonize building and to substitute single-use plastics. That's why we get up in the morning, and that's why we work in forestry to transform resources. These 1,500 people are paid $150 million per year, and there are forestry engineers and biologists who are part of our team, and they guide what we do and how we do it. And they have ethics code, and they show that we are committed to important sensitive issues like caribou. It's been 15, 20 years that we've been talking about boreal caribou, that we've been taking action, that we've been looking at what we do, and we review what we do when the need is there. Unfortunately, the conversation, when people hear about it, is often polarized on a simplistic paradigm that doesn't take into account our current reality. It pits caribou against jobs, forestry against biodiversity, but they go hand in hand. Our practices at Chantier Chibougamau, if they weren't good for fighting climate change and for biodiversity, people wouldn't want our materials. We have that corporate responsibility, which becomes a collective responsibility, as we see with your work on this topic. So we thank your committee for its work last week to broaden the scope, looking at the order as presented today. Issues related to life cycle are fundamental. When clients call us for building materials, the first thing they say is, what is the carbon record for what you have to offer us? And so looking at that, and caribou is essential. And I think we could broaden the scope, looking at the impact on people. So trees that will or will not be available in the Val d'Or region, well, This is about processing here in Gatineau to create tissue paper and Kleenex that people need. And it's important in Ontario as well for tissues that are delivered to hospitals. So this goes beyond our company. And this is the most pragmatic environmental answer to communities with the implementation of such measures. The news is often bombastic, and it says that the more processing is restricted, the more there will be restricted access, and that the more biodiversity there will be. But I'd like to look at the facts with the Val d'Or herd, which has 9 individual caribous. Are we happy about that? No, it's a failure to have gone from 55 individuals to 9 today. The 9 caribou are over 14 hectares. What is 14 hectares? For those who've been to the Olympic Park in Montreal, it's 25% of the Olympic Park of Montreal, 14 hectares, where we have those 9 caribou from the Val d'Or herd. Today, there's a plan for a protected area in Quebec that would take 43,000 hectares. So there's been a moratorium around Val d'Or, and we've respected it. 43,000 hectares is larger than the city of Montreal. That's what's protected around Val d'Or for those 9 caribou. And the order, what's being proposed, is much larger. So for those 9 caribou, it would be taking out 8 times the size of Montreal from forestry. We believe it's important to act, but there are important questions that need to be asked about this. And a last question, Mr. Chair, is what would be the cost for compensation? When land is taken out of forestry, there can be investment elsewhere. And how much would it cost? What would the timeline be? I think that's very important to consider in what's discussed today. Thank you, Mr. Samurai. You have 5 minutes. Well, I'd like to say thank you to everyone. We've given the chair 3 briefs that we find very important that can tell you more about our organization, the voice of the industry. You'll see everything about our industry and how the forestry industry is important for the vitality of the Canadian fabric and Quebec fabric. And so I'm at the end of page 3. I'm going to be speaking quickly. So I want to be clear about how we aim to protect caribou. We are always in favor of its protection, but the federal order is not the solution. This would just seek to protect things in a vacuum and would not allow for tourism, and nobody would be maintaining these multi-use roads to get to different types of activities. So not taking into all factors that affect the caribou and not taking into account the socioeconomic risks is deplorable. That's unfortunately the road the government is taking with its order. The order is not the solution. What we need to protect the caribou, but also biodiversity, are concrete recovery measures, roads, and active management of predators, following up on caribou populations, and more involvement from people who live on the land, especially Indigenous people and the forestry industry. Forestry is a part of the solution, and recent fires in major national parks can remind us of that. Just think of Jasper. That's why we need to stop opposing forestry and the protection of biodiversity. What we need is a pragmatic balance, Mr. Chair, because we think it's possible to have biodiversity and forestry go together, but that it's essential to do so. Some have mentioned that the federal order is only 4% of the land accessible to industry, that it's nothing. But with that same logic, we could say that the ice storm of 1998 only affected 2% of Quebec's land, and so it must not have been a big deal. You'll agree with me that it's not just the area covered that's important, but also its position, its strategic importance, and the number of people and activities that are affected. In the present case, there are provisional zones, zones of interest, and buffer zones. For the interest zone, it's nearly 12,000 square kilometers, generating 1.4 million cubic meters per year that are frozen for forestry. For some, which isn't fully recognized by those who work for the minister, it's unfortunate, some who have forestry certifications, who have seen the cards and will not be able to go in the affected zones, strictly or broadly speaking, because it could bother some clients. It could call into question their forestry certification. So the forestry system in place, well, factories will have to go bid and for what they use, and there's not enough volume already following the fires of 2023, and so the measures taken by the federal government have an impact on the competitiveness of the industry. So prices will go up, and at the end of the year, that price will be reflected everywhere in Quebec, because all plants in Quebec will pay more for wood because it's more rare, and because auctions are there, and the price will go up for all. So does the order affect only a few factories that are in the area? No, it will. The order will affect the whole forestry industry of Quebec starting today. So we are here today, and for the industry, it's essential that we ensure that we'll be able to find a solution. We need a way forward. We need dialogue, a forum where industry and government are present, and we need to state that order with Section 80. Well, there's nothing said about Section 64 for compensation for people and companies that are affected. So people and companies that are affected, well, it's the whole value chain, 130 families and billions of dollars. So it will be my pleasure to talk about this further, but we need a federal, provincial, First Nations industry forum. Now, Mr. Dominic. I'm Gilbert Dominic, chief of the Pequaminic Nation. Our traditional land is a little over 112,000 square kilometers, and it's the whole Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean area. 3 caribou herds. There's the Charlevoix, the Pic-Mocan, and Timiskaming. We have rights for certain of them, and it's about 7 million cubic meters, so we're very affected by forestry. We want to raise an issue concerning the protection of caribou in Quebec. Immediate, urgent actions that are the only measure to take to protect caribou and their habitat. You have a legal obligation to act, and our First Nation plans to take the action necessary to make sure this is treated quickly and seriously. Quebec has never done anything more than speak about protecting caribou. There need to be firm, immediate measures taken, awaiting Quebec's strategy. Caribou is closely linked to the use of land by members of my First Nation. It is at the basis of our culture and our way of life. It has assured our survival for centuries. Decreasing populations has an impact on our culture, our traditional activities in 2003. We've had an obligation to stop hunting caribou. The effect is felt aside beyond harvesting for food. It's about transmitting knowledge and our language. That is also part of our distinct culture that is at risk, as is the species. Despite the efforts by our First Nation for this caribou and its habitat, if it were to disappear, it's part of the identity of our identity that would disappear. I call on the representatives of the Canadian government to take appropriate measures to fully respect at all levels the protection of boreal caribou. I also call on the committee to look at the Superior Court of Quebec decision on the lack of consultation on the protection strategy. A decision was made on June 21st by our First Nation and another one by Quebec's lack of consultation. This is not related to the order, but it's the same issue, the urgency of protecting caribou. All of this is due to inaction from the government of Quebec. Judge Marie Cossette wrote that aside from their right to consultation, the situation of caribou is deteriorating during this time, and the government is not able to indicate to the tribunal when the protection strategy will be communicated. So their rights and ancestral rights are threatened given the central place that caribou plays. So the attitude of Quebec on caribou is lacking, and it's irresponsible for future generations. As a responsible government, there needs to be a balance between protecting land, protecting fauna and flora, and socioeconomic development, of course. So we can only state that less forestry capacity is inevitable. We believe that reducing forestry can be viable by focusing more on the third transformation and on innovation. There doesn't have to be an end to economic development and jobs in our regions. We are sensitive to the economic realities of forestries, but there can be no denial. There needs to be notice taken with objective scientific perspectives. As the Independent Commission on Boreal Caribou has indicated, Quebec has gone too far in forestry, and there needs to be a new look at this sector so that it can truly be sustainable and that there can be protection for biodiversity. The government of Quebec and Canada need to propose measures to mitigate impacts on forestry companies and help them in this inevitable transition. Please turn off the additional microphone in the room. The Timiskaming herd is not targeted by the order, which is a great concern to us because it is vulnerable and it also risks disappearing. Aside from the northern limit, we're also ready to send any document that could be relevant for making your decision. So finally, in the face of this situation, you have an obligation to act in respect of the Species at Risk Act, adopting an emergency order for our area to protect caribou from current threats to its survival.
Thank you, Chief. We want to make sure we have enough time for questions as well. We are a little bit behind. So for the first round, I will drop it down to 5 minutes. Second round, I will reduce it by 25%. So 4 minutes for the second round. So we're only doing 2 rounds, right? Yes, correct. Mr. Gould, you can begin. Thank you to our witnesses. It's very important. We're all here today to speak of the order. That's very radical. This is an incompetent liberal government that's founded upon ideology that's forcing us to face this. They're incompetent because they were unable to uphold policies that had been implemented by the former conservative government. There were two great men, including Denis Lebel, that had developed a priority throughout the forestry industry of Quebec to strengthen the processing aspect of this industry. They did a lot for the forestry industry. However, all of their work was destroyed by the Liberal government, and I was very proud of this work that I participated in. So you talked about caribou herds and the number of caribou. We talked about 200 of them. So you spoke of 9, a group of 9. So we've always said that we need to look at the future and the longevity. Caribou face illnesses as well. The death rate amongst this population is too high because there's low genetic diversity. So we could look for caribou in other regions that don't have the same genetics so that we can strengthen their DNA and reduce illness. That's a part of the problem too. So we're going to be instead closing down an industry that will affect families. But the caribou are not suffering from a lack of food. They're suffering from a lack of genetic diversity. Could you speak to this? Yes, so briefly. In nature, naturally, there's a limited number of times we can be cousins with one another. But we have these two herds, and I think that we have the opportunity to increase this diversity. I think we can all sit around the table and find a solution. It's a question of doing everything that's necessary. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
De notre point de vue, la clé, elle réside effectivement dans l'élevage et la réintroduction.
So there's also the question of reintroduction to strengthen the population. In terms of the Labrador herd, I think it's very important that we look at these aspects here, the reintroduction of the species. But we need to look at what is our real goal. Do we want to support the species and its growth? Or do we think that we've lost the battle because we made so many mistakes? Or do we want to simply sustain the population and keep those individuals alive that we already have? So I'd like to come back to the economic development. The former conservative government was very proactive, but since 2015, do you feel that forestry development is still a priority in your region? Or do you think we've become a little bit lost since 2015? Have you been supported by the Government of Canada in the forestry industry? There are some initiatives for research on the use of lumber in construction that looks at processing. But firstly, we need to harvest before we can get on to these different levels of processing. And we have seen a reduction in the financial support we're getting. We've been talking a lot about carbon. But in order to benefit from all the new initiatives, we need lumber. Thank you, Mr. Gould. Ms. Shanahan? Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Verreau, for having mentioned something I think we all agree with. We are all a part of biodiversity. If we're not able to protect ourselves, to protect wildlife and the environment, then there will not be an economy. The economy requires the environment. I looked at the timeline here. The boreal caribou, since 2000, was identified as a species at risk by an independent committee that monitors the species. Since 2005, through the government of Quebec, in 2016 or in 2005, the government committed to implementing a protection plan for the mountain caribou as well as forest-dwelling caribou. But it hasn't been done. So the government has stated if Quebec implemented the measures that it committed to, we would not have had to make this order. We also don't want to have an emergency order. And it has been publicly stated that we will take into account all perspectives that are heard through consultation. So when we talk about reform in the forestry regime, we're looking to find a balance between the environment and the industry. We know that the foresters that I've spoken to know that we need to protect our environment if we want the industry to prosper. So what solutions do we need to find this balance? I think we've said it, forestry, the sector in Quebec, or rather the government of Quebec, is not doing the necessary work. So we need to change the regime. But we need to do so correctly. We need to take our time. It's been mentioned, the tribunal has stated, what we're trying to say is essentially, take your time to hurry up. Next year, all companies in Quebec will be affected by this order that's not implemented yet, but this will affect all of our companies. So it's the time to act, to work together, to find proactive solutions. I agree with this. I don't have a lot of time. Mr. Pelletier, I'd like you to speak further to the question of what caribou represents for Indigenous groups. I have 2 Indigenous groups in my region, and they say they always think of the 7th generation when they look at sustainability in their development. So this is really an integral part of Indigenous culture. I think you were speaking to me? Yes, Chief. So this is an iconic species in our culture. Of course, our culture is intrinsically linked to caribou in an intimate manner. It's a part of what we eat, how we teach our younger generations. It's related to our language, our values, our foundational principles. And so if it's essential that we protect them, because if we lose the caribou, we'd be losing a part of our culture. So you have personally taken action on this matter because you've stated how important caribou is for your Indigenous culture. You've spoken, though, of hunting caribou for its recovery. Yeah, so in the 80s, we already had our elders telling us about this being beneficial. There have been hunting restrictions since 2003. And we spoke to the government asking that we be more involved in this. This will allow us to protect the survival of caribou. And we really need to work together. Unfortunately, First Nations are never around the table to collaborate and contribute to discussions. We need legal action in order to finally recognize that we are stakeholders in these activities. Thank you, Mr. Simard. The floor is yours. So I want to come back to something that seemed very important to me, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it. It's the cumulative effect. Mr. Verreau and Mr. Sainte-Marie spoke of this. Forestry capacity has an effect on the entire sector. Because we use these products in other areas. So could you talk to us about this cumulative effect? Yes, I can speak to that, and I'd like to also highlight other initiatives that have already been implemented by our predecessors. So Parc Asinica, for example. We're looking for a plan from the government of Quebec, but it does not exist. So there was a reduction of more than 1,000 square meters, and this caribou population went from 500 to 800 individuals nonetheless. And so we have seen that measures have had a positive effect. Around Val d'Or, as a company, we have restricted our activity range, and the caribou population is doing well in this area. So there are numerous credible initiatives that have been deployed. There are conservation measures that can happen at different speeds. In Val d'Or, we have, cottages, mines, and other things that can be maintained, but we're filtering things so that we're focused on processing of lumber. But there have been a lot of initiatives, and it's tens of thousands of homes that have been able to have been built in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. We process a lot of lumber, and we go down to the port of Toronto every week. So the order will have a big effect, but we have already implemented a lot of measures. We're not standing here with our arms crossed waiting for something to happen in the industry. We have already done a lot of very credible things. So we have these net zero goals, and these goals could be made more fragile because of what's going on here. So, Mr. Samaray, could you talk about the potential economic effects if we take into account the cumulative effects and the fact that the forestry industry also has to deal with tariffs in the U.S., as well as the spruce budworm? So, firstly, it's been stated by the IPCC that we need to do three things. First, there's the energy transition. We need to move away from fossil fuels. We need to, secondly, protect biodiversity. And three, we need to move away from carbon, move towards a net zero. And we need to do all these things at once. So lumber is essential in meeting our net zero goals. Secondly, we need to understand that the current forestry system is not working. And it needs to be changed, but it takes time because the price of lumber in 2025 is going to explode because the square kilometers are going to be reduced by the order, and there will be a lack of lumber. And we also are facing forest fires. And this is 70,000 square kilometers in reduction. And there is not much lumber anymore. Mr. Simard, you still have time? Yes, just 30 seconds if I could. Go ahead. So we're talking about the cumulative effects. We also need to look at the impact of the cumulative effects of developing the territory. This doesn't help caribou. So there's a whole range of factors. When we develop land, it creates a more fragile situation for the caribou. Mr. Boulris?
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciated the end of Mr. Samre's answer on the recommendations from IPCC and how that relates to net zero. I have a question for Mr. Pelletier. Earlier in our committee, we talked about managing caribou predators and how this could help in the recovery of caribou herds. There's the example of BC, where they are managing wolves as a predator for caribou, but it's not working very well because they also need to be restoring caribou habitat. How do you see this as a specialist in the forestry sector? Thank you for the question. As you said, I'm a specialist in forestry, but not in terms of wildlife and caribou. So unfortunately, I won't be able to answer that question. As chief forester, my strength is in forestry, and our work evolves over time. So we look at growth rates, we look at how everything is evolving in order to plan for the future, and that's our strength. So we're able to when we make recovery plans, we look at different scenarios, we use the expertise of our team to see how the forest is regenerating and evolving over time to see whether or not this will be beneficial to the caribou. This is an expertise that we have to make our informed decisions for Quebec. So I can't answer your question about predators, but we do have tools to develop strategies and projects, and our expertise is always there for support.
Thank you for your work and the work of your team as well. And now I have a question for Chief Dominique. Since we started this meeting, we've heard that the Quebec government has been promising a strategy. It's been promising it since 2016. And the Superior Court has said you were right, that you weren't consulted enough, and that you have ancestral rights as an indigenous community, and that you have a relationship with the caribou. We need to have immediate actions, knowing that the Quebec government has been waiting on this for 8 years. So what actions need to be taken right now? I agree. In our sector, in Timiskaming, we've seen that there needs to be protection. That's a strategy that we should adopt so that we can have an eventual strategy. Other measures could be applied. Could you please bring up your microphone? That's better, thank you. Some measures could be implemented. What's important is that with the Quebec government and the First Nations and the federal government, make decisions that are quick. Over the last 20 years, the worst thing that's happened is inaction. If decisions had been made 20 years ago, the caribou survival wouldn't be as much of an issue. Thank you, Mr. Martel. Mr. Petier, Mr. Saint-Mray, I have a question over what's been said previously. So there's a lower, like if we reduce access to forests, we lose jobs. Are our calculations different from other countries? Protected areas are the responsibility of the Department of Environment. When they decide to protect part of the territory, the chief forester takes it into account and adjusts the forecasts for the forest so that there is no overharvesting. As part of our work in Quebec, in the recovery plans that have been implemented since 2013, they've been continued on to 2023-2028. At the south of the northern limit, there's over 8 million hectares of protected areas. Those are facts that we take into account in our work, and we integrate that in our work. Do we manage properly the forest to take into account climate change? We can always improve our work and reinvest in the forest to improve its productivity and its resilience in the face of climate change. We have to see how much money we want to invest in public forests. There are other issues in Quebec. I'm not a politician. When we look at the budgets available for forestry, we do what we can. I have a question. The last aspect that was mentioned is important, whether it has to do with the order or other. Money is important. We have to maintain the road network and to compensate for forest fires. There's also the federal order. We will need money to solve things. What the order is doing is the Quebec government is to print some more money and take on this debt. We need to work together so that there are the least impacts possible, because it will cost money. Thank you. Mr. Lauzon, 4 minutes. Thank you to the witnesses to be with us. Chief Gilbert Dominique, you mentioned that signs were seen on the disappearance of the caribou. What is at the basis for today's decisions? Do you have expert reports that show that we need to act quickly to protect the caribou? Yes, we've shared with you the studies we have made with well-known scientists and with our teams on the ground. So you have access to these documents. The way our elders have seen what's happening is by visiting their traditional territory. They've noticed that there were issues. They've seen that land development was a factor, an important factor in this whole situation. These information are available and they've been seen by the users of the land. During the Quebec government consultations, you've mentioned this. Yes, absolutely. We've sent all our documents to the federal government and the Quebec government. In Quebec, considering that the intents of the Quebec government, well, actually, we noticed that the Quebec government didn't want to make a decision. That's why we went in front of the tribunals, because it didn't make sense to us. And if we didn't act, the caribou could go extinct. And we won. From now on, there's a lot of work to be done. We agree that the best way to move forward is to collaborate with the provinces, the territories, the cities, and also the indigenous peoples. There's a socio-economic impact here. We need to sit down together to make decisions. Do you agree? Absolutely. We need to take into consideration the First Nations that have claims on those territories. We should ensure that we implement measures that work. A question for Mr. Pelletier. When you've mentioned that lands that are isolated, is it possible to have recommendations to unlock these territories that we can actually work on? We'll need a quick question, or actually a quick answer as to yes or no. I don't decide on what, I don't draw the maps, the federal government does. So we follow what is established by them. Mr. Simard, 2 minutes. Thank you. Chief Dominique, the threat that the caribou is facing can hurt the sharing of your traditional knowledge. I'd like to know what the caribou represents in your culture. As I've mentioned earlier, beyond the food aspect, there's also the transmission of our knowledge that would be affected, and also it would impact our values, our language, because certain things would disappear. So it would be a great loss for language as well. The decision is clear. The judge said that if the species disappears, it would impact our ancestral rights. Thank you, Chief Dominique. Monsieur Verreau and Samaray, you're calculating the carbon capture per land unit. we're talking about 1.4 million of square meters. What does that represent for building, and what it can represent for carbon sequestration? Mr. Boulris. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question for Mr. Samaray. There's the issue of compensation. If the order had a negative impact on the economy for some communities, would it be more acceptable if there are mitigation measures and financial compensation? Everything is in the details. There are direct and indirect jobs that are supported by this industry. It would cost a lot of money, and there would also be a lot of revenues lost by the government. There would be impacts on the social security net. Chief Dominique, you've mentioned that ancestral rights would be at risk if the species disappears. Earlier, you've also said that you've worked with experts and scientists. Could you please send documents to the committee on scientific data so that it could help with our recommendations? Absolutely. You will have the studies that I've mentioned earlier. Scientists like Martin-Hugues Saint-Laurent and Jacinthe Gosselin, they've worked with our First Nation to analyze the data. Mr. Deltel, when we take into account what has been said so far, we understand that it's very hard to maintain a balance between protecting the caribou and the industry. What would be your first recommendation for Mr. Véro and Mr. Samaray? What would be your first recommendation to find a satisfactory balance for all parties involved? The first thing is to get rid of the order, because that would affect the competitivity of the industry. Second, we need to get everyone together to find a solution. I will only talk about the region in Val d'Or. Right now, we don't understand what the order is useful for the Timiskaming. In this case, we would need to see what's happening. And there's already measures in place to protect the caribou. And we also need to act. Mr. Chair, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll give you the floor back. Mr. Deltel, you're done? All right, there's one question left to end the second and last turn. All good, Mr. Véro. You've mentioned that you've been working on this issue for 15, 20 years. You've also said that your industry has gone through some transformations. There are socioeconomic issues, the forest fires, and others. We know that craft paper is going down, also newspaper and other kinds of paper are not as much in demand. You're mentioning that there are 9 species at risk. Don't you think that there should be an order now? Over the next 30 years, there should be more craft paper used by 2 to 3% a year. It's used for toilet paper, paper towels, food packaging, to replace plastics, for example. In September of each year, we book our sales, and then we can't provide as much as the demand would be. I didn't talk about hygiene products, but for craft pulp, at each step, you're adapting what you're doing. Today, couldn't you take measures to protect the 9 individuals in the Val d'Or herd? We need to find out what happened in this season. There are 9 caribous. There are 43,000 hectares that don't have these individuals. So we're targeting that. I won't evaluate if the caribou has sufficient space in the forest. Scientists and studies and technical data and consultations by the government and the Quebec government. What should I base my decision on if not that data? We need to use data. We're talking about widening the conservation sector from Val d'Or to Rouyn-Noranda. We're consulting, we're using science, we have scientists on our teams, and we need to look at the facts so that we can act for the Val d'Or herd.
Mr. Samre wanted to comment. I just wanted to add that there's also the fact that we need to listen to science, biology and social science and economic science, the 3. So the 3 poles of sustainable development. And also those who conduct biological studies don't do economic studies. The Independent Commission on Caribou by the Government of Quebec from the outset said it wasn't looking at the economy. It was not of interest to them. That report will have no economic dimension. So you, as members of the committee and as elected officials by the people of Canada, you need to take that into account because that's part of governing, taking in taxes and maximizing the well-being of the nation. Yes, we know that. We know governance. So thank you to our witnesses. Thank you, Chief Dominic, for joining us remotely. A good meeting, a long meeting, but enriching. Thank you once again, and see you on Friday.